Welcome everybody, and thank you to Dave and all the organizers of this local initiative summit. My name is Michael Cundick, and I'm going to be moderating this panel full of very experienced and knowledgeable people that I'm very honored to be associated with today. We're going to be talking about the Great Salt Lake, which is obviously an issue that deeply impacts everybody living in this valley. And I'm really grateful that we could get so many experienced people from different walks of life, different perspectives, all with a deep passion for the lake and for the health of this valley together in the same room. I feel very honored even being asked to moderate. I helped start the SLC Air Protectors and the Utah Permaculture Collective over the last few years, and I ran as the Green Party candidate for Salt Lake County Mayor a couple years ago. Not that you necessarily noticed, but I really enjoyed that process. So getting to be with you all is wonderful. I've had a lot of experience with some of you, and I know a lot about the others involved here. We've got some very excellent guests for this topic, and I think if there's any topic that is more impactful, it's hard to say. We've obviously had a convergence of so many important things going on, but I know lately it's been national news as an example of climate change and of how environmental catastrophe can deeply impact huge urban area. So this is definitely on a lot of people's minds nationally, and it's important that we start to wrap our heads around this and work together to create positive changes. So I would love to start by having each panelist have a moment to introduce themselves and what groups you're a part of and what you do to help protect the Great Salt. I'll just go one at a time. I can start with Deeda.
Hello. Oops, can you hear me? Yep. Round of applause for my Cundick. I'm Deeda. I work with the Center for Biological Diversity, and actually met Michael 5 years ago when we were both working to stop the proposed Utah inland port, and that resulted in us creating a coalition that still exists called the Stop the Polluting Port Coalition. My organization is very concerned about Great Salt Lake, primarily from an ecosystem perspective. We're concerned that should the lake collapse ecologically, we could lose entire species of certain birds. So I come to this issue with that in mind.
So, hi everybody. My name is Tim Hawks. It's great to be with you. Thanks, Michael, for emceeing us and leading us through a conversation. I wear a couple of different hats. I've been in the state legislature for about 8 years, and for better or for worse, I kind of became the water guy. So, I've done a lot on water over the past 8 years. I'm in my final term. I decided not to run for re-election, so I'm almost done. But for the last about 6 years ago, I took a job with the brine shrimp industry. And so my day job is I work with the brine shrimp industry, and that totally changed my perspective on Great Salt Lake. So I think like a lot of people in Utah, I grew up, for me, the lake was pretty much outside out on. But working in that industry has really given me a global perspective on just how important Great Salt Lake is. We have people on staff that have been all over the world at the SLC and Hermia and everything else and seen firsthand what we can do as a terminal lake. So that perspective, as the brine shrimp population goes, so goes the ecosystem and vice versa. It's a keystone species, and so we have biologists and scientists that monitor the resource very, very closely. We're concerned about its future, and that keeps me working a lot on Great Salt Lake related issues, particularly over the past 4 or 5 years.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Frankel. I'm the Executive Director of the Utah Rivers Council, and we're a 501c3 nonprofit. Started in 1994. Sorry, I'm just looking at all these stars. Sorry. Me or not, but
No, not you.
Sort of bells. So we've been working to protect the water inflows to the Great Salt Lake, the water budget, especially the single largest source of water, which is Bear River. Bear River provides about 60% of the surface water inflow to the lake every year. And we have been working since about 1998 to defeat a proposed water project the state of Utah has been working to advance to divert the Bear River to the lawns of the Wasatch Front. So Bear River development is a really atrocious project. We were able to stop a couple of the dams being proposed as part of the project when we got legislation passed in 2002. But unfortunately, the state has sort of reinitiated their efforts to divert the Bear River back in about 2014 when they began advancing it. So the Great Salt Lake's really, really important to not just us Utahns, but to really the entire North American continent for 8 million migratory birds across 330 species traveling from every country in the Americas. So the Great Salt Lake's just a critical ecosystem that we really do have to make sure we continue to steward for future generations.
Thank you so much, Zach, and for everyone being here. I really appreciate everyone's time and attention on this. We really do have a rock star group for this panel. I know there's only been a handful of people in recent history who have been able to stop dams, for instance, and I want to thank Zach for that work. And I really appreciate Representative Hawk for being here. I know you've been recognized as a friend of the Great Salt Lake very formally and done a lot of work there. Deeda had a lot of personal experience seeing how hard she works on behalf of people and planet. So I appreciate those who are listening and paying attention, because for me, this issue affects my children and all of our children in this valley that have such excellent perspective at the table. It means a lot to me. I would love to make sure we have a clear enough scope about the seriousness of the problem, seen from a variety of ways, right? There's ecological, there's effects to industry. I think a lot of us have heard that there's a lot of pollution in the lake bed itself, and if we got to a completely dried out situation, it would be a catastrophe. But I think maybe more people aren't as aware that even as the level shrinks, there are problems that are compounding, such as salinity and other elements. So I would love to hear just a little more about the scope of the problem and see it from a broader perspective than just the worst case scenario, perhaps. Would anyone like to start with that?
I volunteer Representative Hobbs.
Okay.
Because he was telling me that he had just been with some scientists that were looking at the salinity issue.
So thanks for the question, Michael. And it's really kind of the question, I think a lot of people have it in mind that if we lose the lake, then we'll have these impacts, and we would. What I think is more poorly understood is that long before we actually lose the lake, so long before the lake goes dry, you'll see very serious impacts. So a lot of the benefits that we derive from Great Salt Lake will be lost well in advance of that. And I think, Deeda and I was just talking about salinity, and I mean, salinity is just the amount of salt in the water, and I think people are like, well, it's the Great Salt Lake, like, duh, like, what's the problem with salt? But the reality is that the ecosystem of Gilbert Bay, and when I say Gilbert Bay, it's kind of what you see from Antelope Island, or when you're looking to the west, or if you're on I-80 headed towards Wendover and you look north, that's Gilbert Bay. And depending on where it's at in its kind of ecosystem cycle, it's either blue or green. Yeah, I didn't get any kind of, but it's basically blue or basically green. You see the pink stuff, that's what we call the North Arm. It doesn't have a lot of biological activity. It's super saturated. It's so salty, brine shrimp can't live there, brine flies can't live there. Almost no birds are there because there's nothing for those birds to eat. But for the ecosystem of Gilbert Bay to thrive, it has to have an optimal range of salinity. Neither too much salt or too little salt. It has other problems if it gets too fresh. But so the problem and the challenge that we're seeing right now, and it's coming up a lot faster than any of us thought, is that the salinity levels in the lake are going up very, very rapidly. As the lake is shrinking, we've got these hot summers, we've had these anemic snowpacks. The salinity in Gilbert Bay right now is about, it's about 18.3, 18.4%. A bad threshold for brine shrimp, brine flies, and everything is 16. So after 16, you start to see stresses to the biomes, those living reefs that are out there, and the other things that live there. 18, now we're starting to see some more serious stresses in the ecosystem. And somewhere between, we don't know exactly where it is, because these systems are unique, but somewhere between 18 and 20, we get a cliff. And the cliff is just, you just don't get the brine shrimp, you don't get the brine flies, and then all the birds that rely on Great Salt Lake, that Zach mentioned, tens of millions of migratory birds, fly through here, they land, and there's nothing to eat. So that's, I think, the one that's really a concern right now. Industry's, still doing okay, but starting to see some impacts. Costs go up. The ecosystem, if you've been out there lately, the encouraging thing is there's still an amazing number of birds. I was out there on Halloween evening and saw tens of thousands of birds relying on Great Salt Lake. So it's a very robust ecosystem. It's tough by nature, by design, but we are certainly putting it under a lot of pressure right now and facing some really critical thresholds, which I think when this becomes a real problem is next summer. So that puts a real urgency in the steps that are taken today.
That was really, that was a really excellent summary on the ecosystem. Let me add a little bit about the air quality and complement what Representative Hawks just said. So the problem that we're seeing is the Great Salt Lake would be probably 12 to 16 feet higher right now were it not for upstream water diversions. So it shrunk dramatically in size, and as that's happened, it has exposed the lake bed. This lake bed is not like the rest of the ground outside of the perimeter of the lake. What the lake bed is very fine sediment that has been carried by rivers into the lake. So it's very, very fine. If you were to pick it up, much of it you can blow as dust. And that dust has a number of toxins in them. And so one of the other problems besides the ecosystem crash that scientists are studying now is what is in that dust. Because when the wind blows, that dust gets airborne and comes to the Wasatch Front and hits us. And as that happens, we breathe in whatever's in the dust. And it's still relatively unknown what the impacts are on human health long term, because the only way to figure that out is with what's called a longitudinal health study, which to my knowledge has not yet been initiated. So doctors basically have to start tracking that kind of health ailment over at least a 10-year period to see if there's an increase. But just one last piece on this, when the wind blows, especially it seems in the spring and fall, it seems like we might look outside and it's all kind of cloudy and you think, oh, it's about to rain or it's going to snow or something. Well, actually, a lot of that is oftentimes is the dust coming in off of the lake. And unfortunately, the dust count, the PM10, particulate matter of 10 microns in size, is so high that it's off the AQI indicator. That's the Division of Air Quality's color-coded chart, the bar chart that they use to tell us in the winter, this is a red air day, stay inside. A red air day is 55 micrograms per cubic meter. That's the concentration of the particulate matter when it's a red air day, okay? And so it's been observed when the wind blows and we have these dust events that the particulate matter concentration is 240. It's literally off the chart. And so we are not even really starting to get a handle on that. The Division of Air Quality doesn't even have a color for that. It's just maroon, everything about red. So we really need to understand that we're experiencing this today. It's not just something that's going to happen one day in the future. We're actually experiencing these potentially health impacting dust events right now.
Just briefly, talk about ecosystem, but I was just going to add that to what Zach said. The other way that it affects that is it's called the albedo effect. So that dust lands on our snowpack. And because the dust is darker than the snow, it absorbs the sun's energy. And so it causes the snowpack to melt sooner. And the most important sort of reservoir that we have in our mountains is this snowpack. So if it melts sooner, that has real serious implications for water supply, for ecosystem health, and everything else. So we kind of get this double whammy with the dust. The other thing I say about dust that I think is kind of interesting is if you look at Utah's worst air quality days, like the worst ones, it's typically when the wind is transporting the dust from the old Sevier Lake Playa, which is 150 miles south and west. So our worst air quality days are when a small terminal, much smaller than the Great Salt Lake, dried up, and it's been dry for a long time, But it just shows you how bad it can get, right? And that's what we see in Owens Lake in California. It's a very, very small lake relative to the Great Salt Lake, but it became the single largest source of particulate dust pollution in North America. So you can just sort of project, you dry that fly out long enough, then it goes from, occasionally having a bad air quality to having a bad situation.
So you can tell from what Zach and Representative Cox just said that this is all very interconnected. Where goes Great Salt Lake, so go we. And if the lake dries up and we're already having air quality impacts, but as they continue to accelerate, you have to wonder if this continues to be a place where humans can live healthy lives. So that's obviously a primary concern. But in addition to that, there is a concern about what happens to the over 330 bird species that rely on the lake. And in some instances, entire populations, almost entire populations of certain species show up here. And so there is concern among scientists that we could lose entire species of birds because they show up at Great Salt Lake and there isn't anything for them to eat. They starve to death. And then interestingly, that raises a set of concerns for our elected officials because something like that, and possibly even before that happens, might trigger something called the Endangered Species Act, which is a federal law. And once a species lands on the sort of watch list or is designated as threatened or endangered, then a series of federal regulations come into play, which I generally happen to love and support, but our elected officials do not like, as we know, our state elected officials, Representative Cox can probably vouch for this, being told what to do by the federal government. And we could actually be in a situation where, that's happening. If this crisis worsens to the point where these bird species face this imminent threat of extinction.
Thank you, Deeda. I appreciate the holistic perspectives from all of you about the scope of the problem that we're facing. I think one of the silver linings of all of the political turmoil that we've been in is this understanding that we all share this space together and that something as critical and urgent as the lake drying up and all of its far-reaching impacts, finding consensus and finding solutions should be on everyone's mind, and it does seem to be more and more so. I think it'd be a good chance to talk a little bit about some of the solutions that might be in the works right now. I know that one of them seemed like a real crazy idea a few years ago, but actually got discussed recently was can we pipe ocean water all the way from the ocean here to fill up our lake? And that was actually discussed at some point. So I'm curious as you go into your solutions, if you feel called to address that, is it a viable last resort? So I'm certain that relocating, a million plus people is also not a very viable last resort either. So I'm curious what you're most familiar with, solutions that you have in mind, and could speak to some of those things. Who would like to go first?
Thank you. The good news is there's tons and tons and tons of options available to us. Solutions are like apples on a tree. You want to pick the low-hanging fruit first. You don't want an apple, you don't get a ladder and go, let's climb 50 feet up the tree and grab one at the top. And so what we see is that, this is just what it means to be an American. Special interests dominate our political dialogue, often our political decision making. And the pipeline from the Pacific Ocean is a gift, a handout to the water development industry. The costs of that project are mind-boggling. I mean, it's probably $100 billion. We need to be so rich to make that the low-hanging fruit would be absurd. Fortunately, though, there's all kinds of other very inexpensive ways to get water to the lake. Look, this is not really, brain surgery, lakes need water. So we need to create a water budget for the lake that is dedicated. So we're the highest or the second highest per person municipal water user in the United States. And the reason is because we have the cheapest water rates in the country. We have the least expensive water rates. So it sounds like a great deal until you go and you look and you realize you're paying several different sales tax revenues to lower the price of water. You're paying property taxes on housing, property taxes on businesses. For heaven's sakes, property taxes on your automobile, which go directly to the water districts and their lobbyists to lower the price of water. So we're not really getting a good deal on water because there are so many free rides we're giving. Schools, churches, and universities account for a significant amount of the water we use, and they don't pay 1 cent in property taxes. The University of Utah uses 15% of all the water in Salt Lake City, and they don't pay a cent in property taxes. If I showed you a map, a GIS map right now of Salt Lake City, and I showed you this, it just has grass on it. No streets, no names, no places, nothing. You know where the university is because it's just got these vast palatial lawns. I mean, just vast acres of lawns. Everybody can tell that's the university. I know how the alignment of the city's laid out without any directions on the map whatsoever. So we have to get a handle on that. It's, you know, the challenge in Utah is it's kind of insular. In the water world, we are having a conversation about water, and we're almost never looking at what other cities in the United States are already doing and have been doing for decades. LA, Tucson, Phoenix, Denver, Albuquerque are way ahead of us because they have implemented comprehensive water conservation programs as early as the 80s and 90s. And so what we've seen in studying those, what the water suppliers that know have seen, is that these populations of these other cities have greatly increased, and their total water use, not proportional water use, not per person, their total water use has gone down. And that's the role of conservation program. Everything from water pricing to education, rebates and incentives, removing non-functional turf. So there are so many alternatives that we can implement. The problem is the dialogue is consistently narrow to just a few options, unfortunately. So what the good news is that suddenly everybody's at the table in Utah wanting to protect the Great Salt Lake. And so now there's going to be this huge grassroots interest in solutions. And, you know, I mean, I could talk to you for an hour about all the different policy measures we could implement. And I'd love to tell you that I thought them all up myself, but the truth is I'm just stealing them from what other cities are doing. There are so many alternatives to implement, and we're just now starting to take our first step.
So let me just say that the challenge with Great Salt Lake is, number one, it took us a long time to get here. So to get into the problem, it took many, many years for us to get into this hole we've dug ourselves into. And so it's interesting, you know, I worked for Trout Unlimited for over a decade. And with Trout, we were like so excited, you know, we could move a quarter-second foot of water at 200 yards to connect some habitat. You know, that was touchdown Jesus, you know, we do a dance and everything else. In Great Salt Lake, you could put $100, you could put 10,000 acre feet in the Great Salt Lake, and it won't make a measurable difference. That's a lot of water. But it just shows you that the scope and the scale of Great Salt Lake is really immense. I mean, this is, I think the lake evaporates like 1 million acre feet or more. That's a lot of water. And so 1 million acre feet, 1 million acre feet, it evaporates, yeah. Yeah, 1 million acre feet, which is a lot. That's like you could cover 1 million acres a foot deep. It's a lot. I don't quote me on that, but it evaporates an enormous. That's the only way water is lost is Great Salt Lake is through evaporation. And right now, I think the inflows are 1.2 million acre feet or something like that. So we're evaporating more than that, more than 1 million acre feet. So, and I say that just to give you a sense of scale, which is, hey, listen, I can rip my strip, that's great, but you're supposed to get a lot of rubber strips to get us there.
So let me talk about some things that have been done. And I will just say the pace of change and the policy response is unprecedented. You cannot point me to more dramatic change quicker in water law and policy than we've seen in the past 2 to 4 years here in the state of Utah. I'm not kidding. Tell me, somebody come correct me if I'm wrong, but the number of bills, significant watershed, pun intended, type bills have been immense. And so let's talk about some of them. There's a reason we're focusing on it. The big ones that we've invested in is water banking. So water banking is a way to share water. So if I normally, borrowing Zach's cup for a minute, if I normally drink all of this water, but let's say I can get by with half, well, can I share that? Historically, you can't. It's really, really hard for you to share that water. So if Zach wants to drink half of his water and give half of it to the lake, you say, I'm sorry, you can't do that, Zach. I know you want to, but we're not going to let you do that. So water banking is a mechanism that allows Zach and everybody else to sort of find blocks of water, put them into a bank, and then take that block of water and put it to the lake. And typically we're talking about agricultural water users when we talk about water banking, who are the major diverters of water in the state of Utah. So if I do this water banking concept with one farmer, that's not going to save the lake. But if I start dealing with 1,000 farmers and basically say, look, I'll give you the economic value for that half a cup of water, right? I'll give you that economic value if you'll put it into a bank so you can take it to the lake. Now suddenly we start talking about 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 100,000 acre feet of water that we can put to the lake. So water banking is huge. And there's some companion pieces of legislation that move along with that. Last year we had the establishment of the Great Salt Lake Water Trust, set up a framework and allocated $40 million for water supply for Great Salt Lake. And to be clear, we had a couple of representatives when we started talking, last year about what to do for Great Salt Lake. We said, God, if we're lucky, we might be able to get $3 to $5 million of the federal ARPA dollars for the lake. Well, guess what? Speaker Brad Wilson got involved, and suddenly $3 to $5 million became $50 million for the lake and $40 million for its water supply. And so the establishment of that framework, of that trust, which can then participate in water banks, is huge. Where are the other big blocks of water that we're talking about? Secondary metering. That sounds totally geeky, right? But the reality is there's about 200,000 people in the state of Utah that don't measure their outside water. And so if me and my neighbor are both on us, and there's reasons why we have secondary water. It's not some big conspiracy. There's reasons that came out. The old irrigation shares were converted into a separate set of pipes that come to these houses. I'm one of those houses. I pay a flat fee of $75. Me and my neighbor pay the same flat fee to have a quarter share in a local irrigation company. And if I use Zach's cup or I use 10 million gallons, we pay the same flat fee. Right? So there's no way to know. You can't manage something unless you measure it. What's super cool about secondary metering is that the studies have shown you can change pricing, like Zach's talking about, and it makes a difference, but it doesn't make as big a difference as you think. Big short term, and then people, guess what? They get used to it. It's like the boils rock. They get used to those higher prices, and their use starts to creep back up again. But what's weird with secondary metering is if you simply tell them, you tell the three of us, we got the same size yard, and you tell us how much water we're using. And how much water we're using relative to how much we used last year and how much we're using relative to our neighbors. The social pressure is amazing. People start using 20 to 40% less, and that water, that sustains over time. So the state invested $250 million, $250 million in secondary metering just this last session to make sure that everybody's measured so that they know how much they're using. You gotta change their pricing. You gotta hit them with the club and just give them information. Give people information that tend to make good decisions. Last thing that we've done is invest heavily in what's called agricultural water optimization. I'm a farmer. I'd love to do your water-wise technology, but guess what? If it's too expensive, I'm not going to do it because you're just going to increase my costs without increasing my profits, right? And I'm just trying to survive. So agriculture water optimization comes in and says, let's help you matching funding. You put in 50 cents, we put in 50 cents, right? You put in 50,000, we put in 50,000. To help those farmers adopt better technology where they can produce the same amount of crops with half the water, right? And that's showing some real promise. $70 million now, and see much more money invested in that. All of these things are designed to generate sufficiently large quantities of water to make a real difference for the world. So sorry about that now, but this is my space.
An interesting fact that I learned recently is that Utah Lake in Utah County in the 1930s dried up completely. It was devoid of water. I might have got that time frame wrong, but that's what's well, and it was because water users were taking all the water, and also there was a drought. But what's interesting is obviously Utah Lake currently is full of water, and so these problems can be solved. And it is really just an issue of getting more water into Great Salt Lake, which, as you've heard Zach and Representative Fox said, can come from a variety of different approaches, and we actually need all of the above. Conservation is critically important, but we've also heard them say that a majority of water is used by agriculture, and that's something that we need to look at very carefully, and look at ways to, as Representative Fox described, incentivize agricultural users to use less water. And also there needs to be maybe a hard conversation about how much agriculture a desert like ours can really support. But I do think that this next legislative session is going to tell the story. So it's critically important that people are engaged with their elected officials on this issue, and that show up during the legislative session of 2023, because as Representative Fox said, and as Zach said, we're on the precipice. We're headed toward disaster, going over the cliff. And these good measures that were enacted during the last session need to be doubled or tripled, honestly, if we're going to stave off disaster.
Thank you, all of you on that. Deeda, I wonder if you'd be willing to go a little bit further. I know you have some thoughts about granting water rights to the Great Salt Lake. Is that something you feel comfortable speaking about just a bit more?
Sure. I mean, I think Great Salt Lake does need designated water rights. And this sort of gets into the water law, which I am not speaking on. But you know, one of the big problems is that the lake doesn't have any designated rights, and so that's why all the water could be taken away from the lake. Now, I don't know, Representative Fox and I'm sure Zach also have thoughts about how steep a hill that is to climb in the legislature. And as you heard Zach say, we need to go for the low-hanging fruit first, and maybe designating the water right for the lake is low-hanging fruit. I don't know. But what I do know is that we have to be really clear about the numbers and how much water needs to go into the lake, because the estimates range from a million acre feet to 2 or 3 million acre feet, and that is a lot of water. And if you look at where that water can come from, it's a fairly limited number of sources. And then, you're basically then going to agricultural users and saying, okay, we can't do this anymore because we need your water. And there are a lot of legal issues, obviously, around that. And I think we may need to be prepared to buy out agriculture. I don't know what do you think?
So there's some really interesting, there's a good example over in it's a terminal lake called Walker Lake. It had been in sustained fund, very much like the city of Great Salt Lake. And Harry Lee, who is the majority leader of the Senate, had the levers of power. Right? So Harry really ultimately allocated about $300 million to try to reverse course with this small chunk lake. And what they did initially is they said, let's go buy out the farmers. And it was a disaster. It made sense, right? So if you want to get the water, the farmers take water. But think about it. If you have a farming community and now every third house is abandoned, and the land dries up, you have weed problems, you have dust problems, you have economic problems. But pretty soon, all of these people that lived around Walker Lake started to hate Walker Lake, right? Because Walker Lake, they felt like Walker Lake was being saved at the expense of their community. And so it turns out that the best solutions typically involve temporary transfers. And the temporary transfers where I can go in and say, hey guys, it's blowing freaking bad. Right? Can I, Zach, back to Zach's cup, can I pay you for half the water? Or even can I pay you in this really dry season? Can I pay you for all of your water this year? Because we really need it in the lake this year. So that winds up being kind of the solution. Let me talk about the situation of the water rights to the lake, and then we'll hand it over to Zach. But something really interesting happened. The way that I talk about it, if you think about environmental uses of water, and there's reasons why it's this way. It's very bad if you care about the environment. But it's almost like if water rights are a game of cards, the environment shows up and all of the cards have been dealt out to other uses. And the environment comes on, the environment says, well, can I have a seat at the table? And historically the answer is no. No, you can't, because the way you're using water is considered waste under the system, so no, you can't have the cards. Now, it's slowly getting better, right? And then they say, well, can I buy? Can I buy into the card game and have a seat at the table and at least start to acquire some cards? That's where he made some headway. And interestingly enough, just last session, one of the important bills for free stream flow, but it was not in stream flow, so I can't remember exactly what it was, is it said, hey, listen, the lake gets a seat at the table. The lake can buy into this card game. What it didn't do was hand cards to the lake. And that's the challenge is if those cards have already been allocated, how do we get cards to the lake? That's the challenge. We force people to give them cards, and you can only buy the cards, and that's kind of the way we're in right now. But I do think very important piece of legislation recognize, number one, there's value in water left in the lake, and we're going to create a legal mechanism to recognize that as a legal right. And that happened this last session. I really like the card game for our nations. Absolutely accurate. It's really good. Summary, represent us are where we can to try and take part in the environment. And it's very difficult. The legislature, perspective, absolutely is not one of the parts to the environment and love so better. And unfortunately, that's still largely. I definitely agree that we're making progress. The progress we're making today in 2022 is progress that other states made literally in 20. So it's a race to save. Questions can be right. I go to a water conservation and it's the nation's gathering of water conservation programs. That do not think about water conservation. We have often teams of staff, day in and day out, all day long. That are kind of like compete with each other about who has the most cutting edge water conservation technologies. And when we go there and talk to them about secondary water use, they say, what is that? What is that? And just Representative Hawk said, it's irrigation canals, surplus irrigation water is no longer on farms, looking at suburbs, subdivisions. And they say, what do you guys say? You're mistaken. We bought all that out, and we put it into our municipal support. And we bought all that out, and we put it into the river. Only here in Utah has the hostility to the legal recognition of water stream as a legal right. So everybody here that drove, you can take your car and you can drive it out
you're subject to traffic laws. But you could go drive that car off, and if you don't do something with it, you might not have broken the law. Okay, water law is very, very restrictive. You may not take your water and do anything wrong with it. You may not put it in the street because it will get lost. If you want to take your water and leave it in the street more than something, that is an illegal use of water. The Utah legislature does not legally recognize the permanent right to do that. I have people walking around and say, I have water rights from this fifth generation farm, and I'd like to give them to your organization to put in the stream, the river. And I say, I cannot legally do that. It will get lost. And so that is and so what is figure out how to get if you're not willing to do, we're not people willing to do. You know, the reason Zion National Park exists today is not because we did, social media. It's not because we have press conferences. It's because Zion National Park is side by office forever. And that's why it's here today. And if you're not willing to commit, that way
So I got to correct Zach just a little bit. Number one is, like you said, I can't put my water up because I felt like it was true until last session. I'm going to. The other thing I just say is, when I was with Child Unlimited for 11 years, I worked with the people across Western states, really all the Western states. We had lawyers who were on the ground, and we often were looking at comparative terms, like how good is a state relative to another in terms of industry flows and ability to pick environment flows and things like that. And so I just wanted to say, if you just look on a comparative basis today, Utah versus those other states, I would argue quite forcefully that Utah is better than Colorado, Utah is better than Wyoming, light years ahead of Wyoming, Utah is on par with Montana, Utah is ahead of Idaho, Utah is probably ahead of New Mexico, Arizona, somewhere in the same range with California in terms of the tools that are available today. A lot of those tools are new and untested. But if you just look at what are the tools that are available, there are a lot of tools available in Utah. Historically, that maybe weren't there. But Utah is kind of interesting and is getting better and better all the time. So I just wanted to make that.
Yeah, I learned a lot from this discussion, and as moderator, I want to be a little more conscious of time. I think this will probably be the last round of comments. And the way I want to stage this question is interesting because it sounds like there's a lot of serious effort getting put in right now to saving the land, all from very, even amongst this camp, a very passionate perspective. It's some serious hard work that's not necessarily. Something I want to point out is that we're reaching that critical mass, right? Where now it's national headlines. Oh my gosh, we're at 2 historic lows in the last year. This is a serious, serious deal. And so this being kind of a direct democracy event, I think we're trying to learn how to get more involved, trying to see signs of hope and find a consensus in the political spectrum. What I would like to hear now is kind of where has the legislature not done enough and what pressure could be put on for consensus in the future, as well as I'd like to invite you as well, Representative Hawkins, since this is your last term, is there any insider wisdom you'd like to share about where pressure is best applied to create positive change for things like the Great Salt Lake? Now that you're kind of moving on your way out, maybe you can share a little more about what helped you reach greater heights with your passion for the projects and how people could respond to your experience there. And any other final comments about solutions and feelings as we try to solve what has obviously not been enough so far?
First, So there's a lot of grassroots activism around this issue right now, and I would encourage everybody who's not involved to get involved. There are many fine nonprofit organizations that, including my own, that are working on this issue. The Utah Rivers Council, Zach has been a leader on water issues for its entire 30 years, 28 years. They're leaders on water conservation issues. I actually met Zach when I was Mayor Anderson's chief of staff, and Zach would call me almost every day to ask about the status of the Riffler Strip ordinance that we were trying to pass in Salt Lake City so that people could take up their turf parking strips and put drought tolerant plants in. He is the most tenacious person I've ever met. Anyway, so there are these great nonprofits out there that are working on this issue. There's going to be a convening, I think on December 10th, that's being sponsored by a coalition called Save Our Great Salt Lake. And that would be an opportunity for people to get involved. There's going to be a rally during the legislative session. And if you're interested in engaging on this issue, just reach out to one of us. Because this has to be a people power movement to save the lake. Our legislators can only do so much, and it absolutely helps them when their constituents are saying, this is important to me. What are we doing to solve this problem? And now I'm representing Fox. Sorry, perspective.
Okay. Thanks, Deeda. So, a couple things. One is when we start talking about millions of acre feet, that gets pretty insane. I suppose there's a little bit of a silver lining there, which is there's two different numbers. So one is if you want to bring the lake back to X, right? You need 5 or 1.5 acre feet, something like that. If you just want to stabilize it so it's not going any lower, and the good news is the lake, even at these low levels, is by and large meeting its beneficial use, supporting the birds, right? Supporting the industries. Our air quality hasn't gone into fabric just yet, right? So that's the good news is. So if you can just stabilize it, that's a great thing. The best numbers that I've heard, it's about 400,000 acre feet to get us to stabilization, 400,000. The reason I say that, I share that, is that number is much more attainable than if you say, I got to find 1 million. Because if we can find 400, you can find 100,000 through secondary metering, you can find 150, 200,000 through ag optimization. You can find those numbers, right? Water banking might generate that. So, it's suddenly that thing becomes attainable. Let me mention just a few other groups that are involved, engaged, like I interact with them all the time. They've been very much thought leaders on the lake. National Audubon Society does amazing work. Nature Conservancy is another one. Friends of Great Salt Lake has been engaged on Great Salt Lake issues for a very, very long time. Very, very good, consensus-oriented, great advocates. Ducks Unlimited. So there's a lot of different entities out there, and I do encourage you to get engaged. And also, it's very helpful. Listen, this is a bipartisan issue. Most of the bills that I talked about historically would have been really, really controversial. They went through the legislature without dropping a single vote. So that tells you Republicans, Democrats, everybody across the realize Great Salt Lake's important. They want to act to protect it. But one of the things that really helps them to hear is an attaboy or an attagirl or just somebody reaching out saying, hey, the lake really matters to me. Thanks for what you're doing. And hey, let's keep working on it, right? They love to hear that kind of stuff. So I think reaching out is a great thing. The last thing I just say is I think about the grassroots around Great Salt Lake, and part of it's just this maturing is we have all these little fiefdoms, right? So we've got Friends of Great Salt Lake. We got the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council. I passed the bill that set up the Great Salt Lake Watershed Council, which hasn't even established yet, right? But so we've got all these little things, we've got all these great groups, but the voice is a bit balkanized, right? It's kind of like all over the map. And I think one thing that really helped the Great Salt Lake over time, I think it's challenging to get there, but is a unified grassroots response. Not so much for playing offense, because by and large, we're passing what we want to pass, right? But defense. So if there's a bad project or something out there, I think speaking with you, of course, would have some, benefit. We just got to figure out how to do it. Boy, I really appreciate the chance to come here and have these discussions. And I've come from a science background, debate. And I was also raised in a household that really appreciates debate and democracy. So I'm willing to disagree about some of what I've heard at the State House. And unfortunately, our State House is just not doing a good job. It is patting itself on the back, and it's trying to catch up, but it's trying to pretend like it's taking things forward. We just are not doing as good of a job as we should. We're being certified wild standards that protect its environment. And I have to correct something that Representative Fox said. The State House did not change stream flows to allow permanent protection. It allowed it through state agencies to be permanent, but for individual water rights holders to use their water right, for 7 years, but it's a limit of 10 years. And this is not change. Climate change has reduced the flows of the Colorado River 20% in the last 22 years to the 20th century average. And that's about what we were seeing water flows into the Great Salt Lake. The watershed, the tributaries of the Great Salt Lake are dropping about 20%. It shrinks our snowpacks, it shrinks our lake. So we have a long way to go to protect the lake. I'm not sure for that. I want to speak to some information to get myself more educated about stabilization and what that means. I appreciate that. But the reality is that we need to be very fluid with this. They may not take their water rights permanently, and that is really part of the solution. Because right now, allowing three agencies to do that effectively bottlenecks the solution to just three agencies, which has its own challenges. The leader, staff time, is struggling to get everything done. We need to open the floodgates of the market to solving the Great Salt Lake because many of the finalists that Tim and Pete are able to raise capital to buy water rights for the lake. Because we send as much water to that lake as quickly as possible. So if we just change two lines of code in the Utah code, we can make a permanent in-stream flow and catch up to other distances that are and create a really viable waterway. So I think the one thing that's hard in my 28 years of lobbying the State House is how voices are excluded from the dialogue. It is the water conservancy districts that really dictate the policies. And that is really why we have such an anti-environmental policies. It's not because there aren't good legislators like Representative Fox here who get elected that want to implement greater protection of our water. It's because the special interests that good legislators have to battle can be so massive. And oftentimes those special interests keep our grassroots voices from having a chance to speak. And I just want to wrap up with this. I have seen a lot of press conferences at the Great Salt Lake over the last 2 summers. I have turned on the television and seen elected officials out there. And that's a great backdrop. But I'm also going to all of the interim meetings at the State House. And I am seeing the public not getting the chance to come to the table and say, wait, here's the policy change we need. Especially during the regular legislative session when the times are really critical. We have to, legislators have to vote on 1,000 pieces of legislation. There just is not time to have thorough dialogue. So that's why these interim summer dialogues, we have really not done a good job in the Utah State House of letting the public come speak. The legislature is the people's house, and the people need to be able to come up there and say, this is what we need to do. So we've got to stop legislating in back rooms and on the shores of the State House, of the Great Salt Lake. We need to bring that into the committees we need to let the public speak and provide.
Thank you all for being here. Let's give one more round of applause for the panelists. This is a great example of people that are all passionate, have very different ideas sometimes, and there's excellent civil discourse and conversation. We're really grateful to have learned personally so much, as well as I hope our audience. I think the other panels are still going a little bit longer, and I think timing-wise, they did a lot for another 5 or 10 minutes for questions. So I'd love to open it up for a question or two from the public, if anyone has one. Sarah, please.
With a lot of questions, but so with the scientific numbers, about like, is there, I guess, do we have like a timeline? Don't ask, basically. And I'm also, I guess, are there any other things that are solving places that are large saltwater body? That's something that that makes it extra. But like, yeah, I was just wondering if there's like a set amount of numbers and how that is.
So the question is kind of time frame for action, as well as this might be a good chance if some of you are knowledgeable about the lake in California dried up and had, that history. Who wants to speak to that?
So maybe starting with the last question first, which is there are a lot of terminal lakes, big saline lakes around the world. Unfortunately, the history there is not happening. So most of these terminal lakes, the biggest one is the SLC, huge inland sea. The Soviet Union decided they wanted to be independent of cotton, so it diverted the waters from the SLC, and over the course of 30 years, it lost 95% of its coast. So it went from being this robust ecosystem to, it looks like something out of Mad Max. And yeah, it's, really dust problems and poor human health outcomes. And, it's like a naming bronze, but similar. Closer to home, we lost a little terminal lake here. Down by Delta was severe lake. But, always like was kind of the poster child for a small terminal lake which was lost altogether, and what happens on this. So, the question about timing, a lot of it depends on what you're concerned about, right? So, if you're concerned about dust, we probably have time to turn the ship around. But honestly, because air quality on average is still pretty good. If the Great Salt Lake continues to go down and stays dry for a long period, we're not going to be able to stand. Because we've seen what's happened in these other systems. But I think, listen, I'm really proud of what's been done, but I don't want to underestimate the urgency of the situation now. We're talking about a matter of months. So if you want to say the ecosystem, so air quality, we can up and down, we can allow some of these long-term solutions to come up and down. We're talking about saving that ecosystem. If we don't act within the next 4 to 6 months to find every emergency level we can, the ecosystem could tip off that cliff I mentioned next summer, probably in July. So we don't have hardly any time at all. And I think a lot of us thought we had more time.
And that's something that concerned me just to add it, like, I was going to ask you about the percentage of water that is from agriculture. That's something that's really concerning, and also exciting for me. Like, I know these California they've been trained as units to understand what and that's like weird because I've seen it on the little bit. I talk about it, but I haven't seen as much like awareness that I feel like basically like how much of a difference could it make if there was like a lot of dollars invested into like actually just telling the community, hey, you actually conserve water and actually conserve it. That's the thing that I feel like we could act very quickly whereas I think all of us need to stop using as water.
Yeah, there's a bunch of things in there. So agriculture uses about
80 to 85% of water. And so people, as they learn about the prices, it's a common act, a lot of things. I'm not actually doing that well. I think you should have a card. But the simplest determinant of behavior change you see it is ever since the price of water.
Okay.
Denver residents use 140 gallons of water per day, according to Denver. Salt City residents use 200 for all water used in the city, according to the city. So Salt City uses 100 gallons more water than Denver. And they're both really identical clients, right? Both have snowpack runoff, following their reservoirs and their water supply. So it's all present that snow now coming down. And so why then so much higher water prices? Well, it's because the price of water in Denver is twice the price of water in Salt City. The price of water in Los Angeles is twice the price. Is twice the price. We all know this, that the price of the commodity are choices. We all got, part of watching gas prices. We all make different choices about driving. Perhaps you buy a different car, perhaps you just didn't drive as much, but it affected your consumer behavior. And so one of the biggest bills right now that we got to influence that house is this bill to get rid of the crop protection law. Very, very wide. Collectors of that tax. The environment's been special. So that's a big test to see if something January. So again, I think there are a lot of solutions. But it's not about taxing. Getting really straight audiences that legislation passed, it's still officially being special interests incentive to continue to burn water, unfortunately. So there's a lot of routines that I guess state that fine.
The city shows us talking about the price, actual price of their water, market-driven solution. So no surprise, this is being sponsored by a public rights. So we'll see what happens with it. It definitely leads to that.
One thing it's cool is we're going to build a theater on Animals Island. We're in the works to build a big IMAX and share the rights on lakes. So 30 or 40 years to go out there and connect to the lake in New York. The other thing that I'd say is I do think one of the things that we have yet to do in the state, this is an area that we're going to work, is to connect people's conservation actions to benefit themselves. So right now you look at the strip, like we have a credit that goes to Great Salt Lake to sort of benefit the overall system. We don't have a way to we can clearly connect the agriculture producers saves water, but we can't to Great Salt. So I think we can do a lot better job in terms of connecting conservation action with the specific benefit.
Yeah, keeping an eye on that proposal to eliminate property taxes on water. Again, coming from a healthy food activist and local food activism perspective, a lot of our unhealthy aspects of the food system we live in are happening because they're so heavily subsidized. And so it's the only way for certain families to afford food. Which definitely throws the whole thing out of whack because we're not seeing the term cost and we're not really seeing how it impacts our health. So hopefully there's a similar connection there. I always kind of bring up like healthy food access for all conversation. Hopefully we can be more transparent about the cost of water and how it connects for conservation efforts, connect to the greater health of Great Salt Lake. I think we could probably do one last question. I saw it, but let's go there.
farmer. I run the CSA program. And so I come from but so here was talking about paying the farmers like to be like also seeds. You take farmers to grow vegetable crops grains of milk, so yeah. But what are we doing also make steps like versus tank water.
I think there's only time for probably 1 or 2 responses on this. Who feels most called to that?
I'll be quick and let Zach touch it too. I'll try to politicians. So once you get your microphone. So the good news is, yes, we are looking at just those things, right? So farmers are going to chase the economics. So unless you can shift those economics for them, they're going to go where you can make the most money. And I think one of the big things that we can do is if we can find economic incentives associated with crop shifts. If you use less water, you can get less water. Can you get credit for that? Can you maybe even sell that to the environment? There's some interesting flexibility things we can do. The other thing that I point out is that alfalfa is kind of an interesting crop. And it's interesting because you can just cut off alfalfa and it will stop watering and it won't die. It'll come out next season. It's a really flexible crop when it comes to water and water storage. So it actually winds up being pretty beneficial when you're trying to do something like water banking, which is something we talked about. Alfalfa is great. If I come to you and say, I'll just pay you for that third product. You can take 1 or 2, but I want the water down the street. Yeah, well, you got to measure all this. You got to figure out what it is, right? But if I've got a corn crop, I've got to get a fixed amount of water to get that crop to mature. And if I'm a little bit less, I lose the whole crop and I just wasted all that water. Not flexible, right? Not a flexible crop. Alfalfa, high water consumption, highly flexible. Look at all that. You got to meet farmers where they're at, not where they want them to be. You don't get very far come along trying to dictate to them. You're going to do that too long. I think that it's really effective. It's really hard to mandate, but it's really hard to incentivize crops in this house like people that so I think it's hard for me to figure out. I never seen people incentivize farmers crop. You might worry about it. So let's come back to what is that all we do is see water on the farm. Usually wet water doesn't work that way. Water, it's right here. You have to incentivize people to share that water. And I don't see how to get out that economics without increasing the price, without getting and that starts to make this.
Bad. We're kind of on
It's a question we can't have enough time for. Thank you for saying that. Definitely a big factor to be on this. Our panelists are going to be sticking around. We're kind of wrapping up now based on the schedule of this event. But I'm really, again, truly grateful for the chance to learn so much more about it. I have some really passionate, experienced people on conference. I think you all will be supporting one democracy by people on this event. I believe we're going to be having panelists stick around. You can ask questions. There'll be some milling about. We're going to have music and things like that beginning at 7. I'll be playing a few tunes myself. Grateful to spend this time with you all. Thank you.